Okay, so good afternoon. This is Parshas Re'eh 5782, and I'd like to today talk about the mitzvah of tzedakah as it appears in our parsha, the mitzvah of giving charity, and as it intersects with our Daf Yomi, with the Daf Yomi. There's the Daf Yomi that we studied in Ksubos today. So let me first cite the two verses that I'm referring to. The first comes from chapter 14 of Parshas Re'eh, which is the verse 22, where the verse states, Aser ta'aser, tithe you shall tithe, eskol tuas zarecha, all the crops of your field, all the crops of your seed, hayotzei asadeh shana shana, you shall tithe all the crops of your field. Now, even though tithes are really associated with giving the tithes to the Kohen, to the Levi, or eating it in Jerusalem, here it's also associated with the mitzvah of charity, because the verse states, aser to aser, and Rashi says, the Gemara tells us, in Gemara in Tainus 9a, tells us, aser b'shvil shetit aser, titashir. If you tithe, you will become wealthy. Aser b'shvil shetit aser, or tithe in order that you'll become wealthy. So this is really the verse. That's not the literal explanation of the verse. The literal explanation is that we have to give certain tithes, but the rabbis interpreted that the more one tithes, the more one will be blessed with wealth. And then later on, as part of the mitzvah of the festivals, we're told in chapter 15, verses 8 and 9, I'd like to refer everybody to chapter 15, verses 8 and 9, or let's try verse 7, 8, and 9 in chapter 15. Again, we're in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 7, 8, and 9. It states, if you have a poor person from amongst your brothers, and one of your gates in your land, that God gives to you, don't harden your heart. Don't close your hands from your brother who are poor. Rashi says, one of your gates. What does this mean? That the poor people of your city come before the poor people of another city. Those mates, don't harden your heart. So Rashi gives the explanation. We won't go into that one now. From your brothers who are poor, if you don't give him, in the end, you will be the brother of the poor. Patoach tiftach, what must you do? Ki patoach tiftach es yadchalo. You must open up your hand for him. V'hav eight tavitenu, and you must you have to give him the money. If not, if he doesn't want to take it as a gift, Rashi says, give it to him as a loan. And then de machsoro, whatever he is lacking, you must give him. Asher yachsaro, whatever is lacking to him. And this is what the Talmud tells us, that you are commanded to give him, as Rashi cites the Talmud, even a horse to ride on, and even a servant to run in front of him. Meaning to say you're required to give him that which he is lacking. It's a subjective amount. Not everybody is lacking the same thing. So these are the verses of the Rashi. Again, there are these are the verses with the Rashi. And again, these verses refer to the mitzvah of charity. And I wanted to cite them for us, and we'll go into some more details with them, because it relates to the Daf Yomi today and tomorrow. So the Daf Yomi mentions this. Help me open up our Daf Yomi, because today's Daf Yomi was 49. Memtes, and the Daf Yomi mentions it on Daf Memtes and also on Daf Nun on 50. How is it mentioned on today's Daf Yomi? So the Talmud discusses the obligations that a parent has to have in supporting a child, the amount of tzedakah that a parent must give to a child, and the amount of the support a parent must give to a child. And from a technical perspective of Jewish law, the obligations are not as numerous as society thinks they are. And in fact, as a practical matter, Moshe Feinstein said that we have to be much more expansive than the Talmud, because in today's society, parents support children much longer. But in the Talmudic times, there were parents who were shirking their responsibility. And so the Talmud discusses how we force these parents to give support to their children, either by embarrassing them, by making fun of them, by ridiculing them, but they're saying you have to do your responsibility. But then they say, if the parent himself was wealthy, if the father has money, then we force him even against his will to support his children when they're still within the age that he's required to support them. And Rashi explains that the reason why we're able to do that is because then it's like charity. And even if they're not his children, we can force him to do it. And the Talmud explains that Rava in the Talmud, Kafye Rav Nasan bar Ami, he forced Rav Nasan, va'apik mine dal mea zuzi l'tzedakah. He withdrew from him 400 zuzin, an enormous amount. When you think that usually the ksuba is 200 zuz. So this is twice a ksuba. Ksuba is usually 1 year to support. So this is 2 years support. He withdrew from Rabbi Nassim bar Ami for charity. So we see from here that you can force somebody to give charity. The community forced him to give the charity. Tosfos asked the question. Tosfos says, how can the court force somebody to give the charity? How is that even possible that the court can force somebody to give the charity? There is a principle in the Talmud that whenever the matan schara is betzido, whenever the reward for something is written on the side of it in the portion, then the court can't force you to do it. So it says in the Torah that you should give the charity so that God shall bless you. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 10. Let me cite the verse. And so we stopped right before it, but it says in chapter 15, verse 10, it says, Nason titain lo, you shall give him the money. Do not let your heart feel bad when you give him. Because on account of this matter, God will bless you. With all your work. So we see from here, hold on one second. Hold on, I see the question, just give me 1 minute. So we see from here that on account of this matter, you will be blessed. On account of this matter, you will be blessed. By giving the charity, God is promising you that you will be blessed. So if that's the case, if this is a commandment which we're given the reward for, Tosfos says we have a principle that court does not force anybody to do something if the Torah tells us the blessing for it. Ein betin shamata musarin aleha. Then the courts below, the human courts, are not commanded to enforce these laws. So how could Rav have forced Rav Nasan bar Ami to give the charity? So Tosfos gives 3 answers to this question. First of all, his first answer is akfiye bidvar, means they just forced him with words. They just forced him with words. They didn't actually put him in jail or give him lashes. They strongly encouraged him. They put him in a room and they had all the rabbis around him screaming at him, or they embarrassed him in public until he gave the charity. Alternatively, Tosfos gives a second answer. So all the people in the town had agreed that they're all going to give this amount. Everybody agreed it. Therefore they forced him. Meaning, it's not that they forced him necessarily for charity, but everybody in the town made an agreement that this is what we have to do in order to live. It's almost like a condo association. that they or a co-op, whatever, that they all agreed to give a certain amount. And the third approach is that by charity, it's not that they're forcing him to do a positive commandment, but that there's two negative commandments also from our portion, until you can force people so that they don't violate a negative commandment. What are those two negative commandments? Lo ta'ametz et levavcha, do not harden your heart. Lo tikfotz et yadcha, don't close your hand. So therefore, those are the prohibitions that they forced him not to be in violation of. So I know that people have their hand up, but I just want to make one more point about this. This is the first point of the intersection of our Daf Yomi with the Torah portion. But then on tomorrow's Daf, we again have this intersection, because says Amar Rabbi Eli, or on 50a, Be'usha Hiskinu, they made a reform in the town called Usha, that the Sanhedrin, we know that when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai escaped from Jerusalem, he said, Tein li Yavne v'chachameha, give me Yavne and its scholars. And as a result of this, the sages went, the Sanhedrin left from the Lishkas Haragazis, Lishkas Hagazis, it left from the Temple Mount, from the hewn out chamber, which was on the Temple Mount, and it went to Yavne. And then the Sanhedrin went to 10 different stops along the way before it finally closed down. The last stop it went was Tiberias. Then Napoleon tried to revive it, and Rabbi Steinsaltz, a blessed memory, tried to revive it. But one of the last places they went in the post-temple period was Usha. And in Usha, they made a series of reforms. And one of the reforms that they made was Hamevazves, that one who wants to, most understand this as follows, one who wants to give charity, Al Yevazves Yoser Michomesh. You're not allowed to give more than 20% of your money to charity. And Tanya Nami Hachi, indeed, the Brisa supports this. It says, Hamavazves Al Yevazves Yoser Michomesh. You're not allowed to give more than 20% to charity. Toso says it means that the first year you give the charity, you give from your net worth. And from then on, you always give it from your income. Not like Warren Buffett, who has no income. We're not talking about tax loopholes where you can make believe you have no income, but we're talking about like your real income, what you're getting. And then you give 20% from that year on, but you're not allowed to give more than that. Why? Shema yitzdarech lebrios. Lest you give so much money that you're then going to need to get help from other people, because you yourself are going to fall into a state of being supported. So that's the idea. And you're not allowed to give more than 20% to charity. And what's the source of this idea? So the Gemara says, Maikara, what is the source for this idea? What is the verse that supports this idea? It says, B'chol asher titein li aser asrenu lach. The Yaakov Avinu, before he left the land of Canaan and he ran away, he makes a vow to God. He says, whatever you give me, aser asrenu. Whatever you give me, aser asrenu lach, I will make a tithe to you. But it says it in a double. Aser asrenu, tithe I shall tithe. And that's a double tithe. That's 20%. And that's the source for this idea. And it relates to our portion where we use the same idea of aser to aser, tithe you shall tithe. So this is the idea that you're not allowed to give more than 20% of your money to charity. However, lest anybody get too comfortable with this, the rabbis say that they carve out exceptions, and there are at least 6 exceptions to why a person should be giving more than 20% to charity. Number one, if the person's last name is Musk or Bezos or Zuckerberg or Gates or Buffett, or the people, or but by the way, even many of us who are comfortable, if this person is so wealthy that they could give more than 20% and they wouldn't be needing to go on the dole, then it's okay, because the whole purpose is you're not allowed to give more than 20%, because then you yourself are going to need charity. But if you have a net worth and you could afford to give more than 20% without really falling into to need charity, then it's not a problem. So you have to see how much money you have. But somebody like Warren Buffett can give 99% of his money to charity and still be probably wealthier than anybody on this call. He'll still have over $1 billion probably, or something like that. So that's the first exception. The second exception is prior to somebody's death. You're allowed to give more than 20%, because before one dies, you're not going to need the charity. You have to put aside money for your funeral expenses. You could leave some for heirs, but you're not going to need the money. So prior to your death, you could give away more than 20%. A third exception is if the poor people are standing in front of you and they're desperate for the charity, then you're able to give more than 20%. And the reason, and when the Talmud says you're not allowed to give more than 20%, that's where on your own you're going to look for poor people. That's where you're searching out the poor people. But where the poor people come to you, then you're not allowed to close your fist in front of them. And then you could actually end up, under those circumstances, give more than 20%. A fourth explanation is from the Chafetz Chaim, the Avos Chesed of the Chafetz Chaim. He says that which it says you're not allowed to give more than 20%, that's if you do it for somebody's living expenses, or if you're giving the money from your own living expenses, like, for example, from money you need for your house. However, but if you have a specific amount of money that you have a budget that you need to live on for your house, and then you have more that's left over, then you could do it. And so then he says, not a problem. And the fifth explanation, the Chafetz Chaim gives another explanation. He says that if a person, if he would not be spending his money on this, he would be spending his money on nice clothing, on fancy things, on luxury items, then it's also, you could end up giving more than 20%. And then the sixth explanation is that if a person is feeling tremendously like they need an atonement for their sins, they could also give more than 20%. I said these are six, but these are in addition to the main one that the Chafetz Chaim gives. The Chafetz Chaim said, and this was famous, it's often repeated, he said, however, to support Torah institutions, he says that you can give more than 1/5. He says, why? Why can you do that? Because the person is not giving it away. The person who's giving the money is actually in partnership with the Torah institution. First of all, he says you could spend it on your own Torah study, your own education, but also to support an institution. This is like the concept of Yisachar Zevulun, our partners in the Torah study. So therefore, you're allowed to give the money for that, even more than 20%, because you are part of the Torah institution by doing that. When I was studying this morning, this idea with the people in our yeshiva, with some of the students, they raised the point to me. They said, look, there's prisoners who we correspond with. You know, it's led by our friend David Balto. I don't know if he's on the call today. I'll see if David is here now. I don't see him, but he's often here. And David really does, 99.9% of the work, but we correspond with the prisoners. And many of these prisoners are not getting out of jail, and they like to be a part of our Torah study. So they make like pennies on the hour, literally, and sometimes they send donations to the yeshiva. So last week we got a very moving donation. One of them sent a donation of $20. So it was very powerful, but is it a violation of this? It's more than 20% of his salary. So but the point is, this person wants to be a part of our Torah study, and he wants to achieve an atonement for his sins. So therefore, for those two reasons, it's not a violation for him to give that money. So all this is just the intersection of the Daf Yomi and the portion. I'll just stop the recording, and if anybody has any questions before we emphasize this even more.